The origins of the name of Kingsbridge are open to debate. One tale tells of a king being carried over the brook here, others that it was named after a bridge linking the two royal estates of Chillington and Alvington in the 10th century. Whatever the origin of the name, anyone looking for the King's Bridge would be out of luck today. Abraham Hawkins in 1819 referred to no fewer than 6 bridges over the various leats and brooks, but they have all been channelled underground, as ready as ever to flood at times of high tide and heavy rain. Perhaps we should be thankful that we're not forced to travel by boat from Mill Street to the King of Prussia in Bridge Street, which Sarah Fox tells us was necessary during a flood in November 1825. The church spire was a useful landmark to the ships which used to come up the estuary to unload their cargoes at Dodbrook Quay on the right, or Squares Quay in West Alvington on the left. Kingsbridge itself, although positioned at the head of the estuary, did not have a quay of its own. The natives of Kingsbridge will tell you that they live in the real capital of the South Hams, well before the modern administrative centre was sited in Totnes. Originally 2 neighbouring market towns, Kingsbridge based around Fore Street and Dodbrook around Church Street, the 2 towns were only united on the 25th of March 1893. Before that date, the 2 towns had their own offices and held their own street party celebrations, although the individual markets had already merged.
Looking across Kingsbridge Estuary at New Quay with the steam-paddled steamer Express at the quay. Built by William Date at his neighbouring boatyard in 1885, she weighed about 140 tons and was described at her launch in March 1885 as follows. Her model is graceful and her lines sharp and clear. She is constructed with the view of obtaining considerable speed, but with sufficient beam to ensure steadiness. The vessel is to receive every modern improvement calculated to increase stability and conduce to greater speed. The excellent workmanship and admirable design of the Express are certain to increase the very high reputation which Messrs. Date & Sons enjoy as the builders of a very superior class of vessel. She worked the Kingsbridge to Plymouth run for many years, but was sunk by a U-boat in 1915. New Quay was built in the early 19th century to take advantage of the deep water channel at the eastern bank, as the head of the estuary had silted up. When the head of the estuary silted up and Dodbrook Quay became unusable, the New Quay was built, where the deep water channel came close to the eastern bank to take the many ships that needed to load and unload. In the fields behind, barracks were built in 1804 to house 600 soldiers for fear of an invasion by Napoleon. When he was defeated in 1815, many were dismantled. Some, such as the hospital and bakehouse, remained and were used as houses for many years. According to one source, a building down beside the estuary, and apparently used as a changing room for the officers, became the New Quay Inn to satisfy the thirst of the ship's crews. Another source insists that the building was actually a boathouse. The warehouses were used to store fertilizers shipped in from South America, and also to store grain, and were regularly visited by local farmers, who also enjoyed a tipple at the pub. Originally owned by John Froude, by 1844 John Earl Bond owned the property, and as late as 1962 the proprietor was Bill Bond. Over the many years of ownership by the Bond family, New Quay became known as Bond's Quay. Passenger ferries from both Plymouth and Salcombe also used this quay when the tide was low, and the Salcombe ferry still uses it today. The trees had disappeared by 1915, and the inn, originally the New Quay Inn, is now called the Crabshell.
The head of the Kingsbridge estuary extended all the way up to Prince of Wales Road until 1950, when it was filled in. Ryford Garage was started after the First World War by Harold Dunsford Perkins, with the support of Major Stapleton Cotton, who was at that time living at Dodbrook Manor. The two men had served with the Red Cross during the war. The garage began life as an ex-army Nissen hut, but grew to completely hide Ryford House behind it until the demolition of both house and garage property in 1970. Initially it was replaced by international stores, more recently known as Gateway, until the building of the big Summerfield supermarket off Cookworthy Road in 1992, and it is now Peacock Stores. The Anchor Hotel on the right, originally the Blue Anchor, is mentioned as far back as 1777, though at the time it was a much more modest property. In the 19th century, the Anchor was a centre of social and commercial activity. The annual Tradesmen's Ball was held there in 1860, and it was popular with masters of vessels and on market days. As the booking office for the Kingsbridge to Dartmouth coach service, it was always busy. In 1861, the landlord was Richard Horswell, a Crimean War veteran and described as every inch a soldier. In 1983, the building was completely renovated and renamed The Quay. Looking up towards Kingsbridge from the east bank of the estuary in about 1900, showing a steam packet ferry towing 2 barges. At one time there were 3 ferry services a day to and from Plymouth, with an overnight stop at either end and calling at Salcombe in passing. For many years the spire of St Edmund's Church was used as a navigational aid for boats coming up the estuary. Most of the ships exported corn, slates, cider and malt. Much slate was exported to Holland, but that trade route closed down in the late 18th century and was never reopened. Trade with Newfoundland in Canada continued to flourish, and Lydston cast iron cooking ranges can still be found there today. Kingsbridge came late to the idea of a railway station. Plans in 1864 were abandoned as problems piled up and the finance ran down. However, in the late 1880s, a more determined effort was made to link Kingsbridge to the railway network, and after the GWR stepped in to rescue the scheme, the South Brent to Kingsbridge Railway was finally opened in 1893. The directors of the GWR, being by now rather accustomed to railways, were surprised at the enthusiasm shown along the route by the locals. Unfortunately, the railway was built rather late in the railway era, and the increasing use of cars in the 20th century led to its closure in 1963. Plans to maintain it as a tourist line were dashed when British Railways sent in the contractors to lift the line while negotiations were still going on. The tracks were apparently sold to an Eastern European country for reuse, as they had only been renewed in 1961 and still had many years of useful life left.
Considerable changes have taken place on this part of the Kingsbridge estuary. The War Memorial and the shelter have been added. The memorial is largely obscured by the memorial shelter, and Squares Quay, on the West Alvington side of the estuary, is completely different. Instead of the current car park, leisure centre and swimming pool, there used to be a thriving sawmill and a quay with ships loading and unloading timber and other goods. The Promenade and Embankment Road are comparatively new creations. Originally, the road through Dodbrook to the coastal villages ran down Ebrington Street and over by High House. The shopkeepers of Ebrington Street were dismayed at the building of a rival route, as they feared it would destroy their trade. They were quite right to worry, as Ebrington Street is now almost wholly residential. However, the promenade and the Memorial Recreation Ground just to the right of this photograph are much more pleasant places to walk along. Looking south down the estuary with the Ship and Plough Hotel, now the Ship, on the left, and the drinking fountain commemorating Queen Victoria on the right, this is a view of some of the preparations for World War I. On August 6, 1914, between 800 and 900 horses were gathered on Kingsbridge Quay for inspection by the army authorities, a scene which was repeated elsewhere in the area, for example in Everton-Givard. A large number were purchased from this Kingsbridge gathering for use in France, pulling guns and transporting equipment, The loss of so many horses had a serious effect on the small farms of the South Hams, as elsewhere in the country. An eyewitness account by Mr. J. Pierce of 8 Fore Street remarked, "Never were there such a number of horses seen in Kingsbridge within living memory, extending in double lines up to the end of Ilbert Road, down the quay, to the end of the promenade and up to Market-place. Horses of every description, carriage horses, hunters, hacks, light and heavy. It being early closing day, shops were shut and everybody turned out to see such a sight. I saw 56 splendid animals being entrained at Kingsbridge Station for Bulford Camp on Salisbury Plain to be trained for heavy field artillery before being sent to the continent."
The drinking fountain, originally situated at the crossroads of Kingsbridge Quay, close to the site of the present roundabout, was erected to commemorate the reign of Queen Victoria. Designed by Mr. Herbert Reed of Exeter and built by public subscription, the estimated cost was £150. A letter from the fundraising committee in January 1902 stated that £110 had been raised and that it was hoped to raise the rest quickly from the many who had not yet subscribed. So much sorrow for our beloved Queen's loss and affection for her were professed at the time of her death, that it would indeed be a disgrace that a town like this could not raise £150 to carry out the only scheme by which it is proposed in a practical manner to give effect to our professions. The fountain was formally opened on the 22nd of December 1902 by the local MP, F.B. Mildmay. Its base was of grey Dartmoor granite, while the superstructure was Gwitting stone from Oxfordshire, a rich yellow colour which was felt to blend pleasingly with the granite. The whole structure was a little over 15 feet tall and, according to a contemporary description, bears brilliant incandescent lights which illuminate the whole quay. It was removed in the early 1960s as part of road improvements, and although the base has been returned to Kingsbridge and is now situated behind the bandstand, the superstructure has disappeared.
Abraham Hawkins, writing in 1819, described the buildings of Kingsbridge as mediocre, leaving little room for praise or censure. By the 1880s, however, it could be said that there were some fine buildings, even by the quayside, which would normally be dominated by storage sheds and warehouses. Ryford House, for example, in the centre, and the Anchor Hotel on the right, across the road from the Ship and Plough Inn. Low tide at Kingsbridge Estuary in the late 1800s. Given the smell and sucking power of the mud on the estuary bed nowadays, standing in the centre seems to be a rather foolhardy and unpleasant experience. In the background, in front of Ryford House, are stacks of logs being seasoned. When the sawmill was running on the west side of the estuary, logs would be left in the water to salt and season, and then stacked on the quay before being finished in the sawmill. Behind the buildings at the head of the estuary is the mill, which was demolished in 1984. Originally a corn mill, it had been converted to manufacture woolen cloth by 1798 and only ground a small amount of corn so as to abide with the terms of the lease. However, a decline in the woolen trade led to the mill's reversion to its original use in 1845.